Welcome, everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive into, well, a really complex world where energy, geopolitics, and national strategy all collide.
Yeah, it's a fascinating intersection. We've gone through a lot of material to try and piece together a clearer picture for you.
We're looking at how these things are all tangled up: energy production, international relations, basically how countries pursue their goals.
Exactly. We'll be touching on some key areas like the huge impact of the U.S. shale revolution.
Right. And China's big Belt and Road energy plans.
We'll also look at Russia and how they've used energy as, well, a tool.
Plus the Middle East, after the Arab Spring, things are still shifting there.
And we can't ignore the big push for the energy transition, climate change pressures.
Definitely. And tied into all that, the rising tensions in places like the South China Sea and even the Arctic, specifically looking through that energy lens.
Our goal here is really to connect these dots, pull out the crucial information, and hopefully reveal some maybe surprising insights into the global energy map today.
Okay, so let's start with something that really fundamentally shifted America's place in the world: the shale revolution. For ages, the assumption was the U.S. would just need more and more imported energy. We all remember the oil crises back in the 70s.
Right, that was the narrative: vulnerability, dependence.
Exactly. But then came technologies like hydraulic fracking, especially in places like the Barnett Shale in North Texas, basically cracking open dense rock deep underground to get at trapped oil and gas.
And this stuff was thought to be, completely out of reach before. It wasn't easy either. You had pioneers like George Mitchell plugging away for years, facing skepticism, until companies like EOG finally made it work commercially.
And the sheer amount of gas they found, it was staggering.
Oh, absolutely. Mark Papa at EOG, he saw it early on. People went from talking about BCF, billions of cubic feet, to TCF, trillions. It's hard to even grasp that scale increase. It's like finding a whole new energy superpower underground.
A massive shift. And the impact wasn't just, oh, we have more gas. It fueled real economic growth.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty striking. Like, the U.S. trade deficit in 2019 estimates suggest it was over $300 billion lower than it might have been without shale compared to, say, 2007 levels.
And think about investment: over $200 billion flowed into new chemical plants. Manufacturing got a boost, jobs were created.
Even household energy bills came down. And that cheap natural gas, it actually brought industry back. Dow Chemical, for instance, had been investing heavily in the Middle East for cheap feedstock, but then they pivoted, putting billions back into the U.S. because the economics suddenly made sense here.
It's incredible, and it totally flipped the script on imports and exports too, right?
Completely. Take Cheniere. Their whole initial business plan was built around the U.S. needing to import LNG, liquefied natural gas. That was based on forecasts of shortages back in the early 2000s.
Right, I remember that concern.
But the shale boom just blew those forecasts away. Suddenly there was a glut of gas, so Cheniere and others had to scramble and completely reinvent themselves as LNG exporters.
Wow. So we went from expecting shortages to becoming a major global supplier.
Exactly. And that shift from potential major importer to major exporter, that gave the U.S. a whole new level of geopolitical influence. It could offer energy security to its allies in a way it just couldn't before.
Which leads to that whole debate about lifting the ban on crude oil exports. That was politically charged.
Very. But Senator Lisa Murkowski, she argued, quite effectively I think, that keeping the ban was like imposing sanctions on ourselves, and that allowing exports would actually help allies, especially with concerns about Russia's actions in Ukraine.
So it wasn't just economics, it was a strategic calculation.
Precisely. It shows how this domestic energy boom rippled outwards, reshaping America's strategic posture on the world stage.
Okay, so while the U.S. is becoming this energy powerhouse, what's happening elsewhere? Let's look at China in its Belt and Road Initiative.
Right, the BRI. It's this huge, ambitious vision to basically redraw the economic map of Asia, Eurasia, and even beyond, with China sitting right at the center of this new global economic order.
It seems to have two main goals, yeah. Secure markets for all the stuff China makes, but also lock down access to the energy and raw materials it needs to keep its economy humming.
That's the core idea. Build infrastructure ports, pipelines, railways, roads to connect everything back to China. But there's always that question hovering over it.
Is it purely economic, or is there a deeper geopolitical game being played? Is it about creating a sort of Chinese sphere of influence?
Well, that's the big debate, isn't it? The official line is economic development, win-win cooperation. But critics see a clear strategy to build dependency and gain political leverage.
And it's not just limited geographically, is it? It seems to be about strategic projects wherever they make sense.
Exactly. It's not just about neighbors, it's about finding strategically important, financially sound projects. That's why you see countries far beyond Asia, even some EU members, and Panama, for instance, getting involved.
Panama. Interesting.
The focus is on connectivity. China's heavy involvement with the Panama Canal is a prime example of that, linking oceans, facilitating trade flows.
And energy is absolutely fundamental to this for China. They became a net oil importer way back in 1993.
Right. Their economic growth just exploded, far outpacing what they could produce domestically, even from huge fields like Daeking.
And they were worried about supplies, weren't they? That whole peak oil fear in the 2000s.
Definitely. There was a real anxiety in Beijing about potentially getting squeezed out of global energy markets. So securing reliable, long-term energy supplies became a top priority, and the BRI is a key vehicle for achieving that. It's about diversifying routes and suppliers, reducing reliance on any single choke point.
Makes sense. So securing energy flows is baked into the BRI strategy.
Absolutely. And some argue there's another layer too, the potential for debt diplomacy. If countries struggle to repay loans for these massive infrastructure projects, China could gain significant long-term leverage.
Okay, let's pivot to another major energy player, Russia.
Right. Under Putin, energy, oil, and gas especially became absolutely central to Russia's entire national project. It was about restoring order after the chaos of the 90s, stabilizing the economy, rebuilding state power, and, critically, reasserting Russia's position as a major global force.
And the money that flowed in was just enormous.
It really was. Between about 2000 and 2012, the value of Russian oil and gas exports just skyrocketed. It transformed their finances, allowed them to pay down debt, raise living standards, and significantly modernize their military.
But it wasn't just about the money, was it? They've been accused of using energy as a weapon.
That's certainly the perception, particularly in some countries. Take Ukraine, for example. After the pro-Western Orange Revolution, you saw Russia getting much tougher on gas pricing. Ukraine had been getting gas much cheaper than Western Europe.
And Moscow wanted control over those pipelines running through Ukraine, right?
Yes, that was a major point of friction. Ukraine saw those transit pipelines as vital national assets, crucial strategic leverage, and fiercely resisted Russian attempts to gain control.
It's interesting how differently that relationship was viewed across Europe.
Very different. In Western Europe, particularly Germany, the dominant view was that energy ties with Russia were mutually beneficial, almost a geographic inevitability. You know, Russia has the gas, Europe needs it. Good business.
But further east?
Further east, in Central Europe, there was much more anxiety, deep-seated historical distrust, and a real concern that Russia would use that energy dependence for political coercion. Projects like the Nord Stream pipeline directly under the Baltic Sea, bypassing them, really amplified those fears.
Of course, Russia also needs those European markets for its revenue. It's a two-way street to some extent.
It is, but the power dynamic isn't necessarily equal. Then you have the sanctions, especially after the annexation of Crimea and the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17.
Right, those targeted Russia's finances, defense, and specifically its energy sector, trying to hinder development of new resources like shale oil, Bazhenov Formation.
The long-term impact of those sanctions is still debated, but they certainly complicated things for Russia's energy ambitions, pushing them towards developing more domestic technology.
And Nord Stream 2, the second pipeline, became hugely controversial.
Oh, massively. Eastern EU states were desperate to stop it, seeing it as purely a geopolitical project to increase their vulnerability. Others in Europe saw it more as a commercial venture, enhancing their own energy security.
And some even suspected the U.S. opposition was partly about promoting its own LNG exports to Europe.
That argument was definitely made. It's worth remembering, though, that even if Nord Stream 2 was stopped, gas could still flow through other existing pipelines, including those through Ukraine.
So as things got frostier with the West, Russia started looking east more concertedly.
Yes, that pivot to Asia, particularly China, became much more pronounced. They formalized this strategic key partnership. The roles seem pretty clear. China brings the manufacturing muscle and the finance. Russia provides the energy, the raw materials, and geopolitical alignment, often against what they both perceive as U.S. unilateralism.
And we saw concrete projects emerge from that.
Absolutely. The ESPO pipeline, East Siberia Pacific Ocean, dramatically increased oil exports to China, making Russia a top supplier. China even made huge prepayments to Rosneft, the state oil giant, for future deliveries.
And the power of Siberia gas pipeline.
That was a landmark moment in 2019. Both Putin and Xi Jinping called its inauguration genuinely historical. It physically connected Russia's vast gas reserves to the huge Chinese market, a major symbol of this eastward shift.
And Russia's also becoming a bigger player in LNG, right? Not just pipelines.
Yes, especially with projects in the Arctic like Yamal LNG, this gives Russia much more flexibility. They can ship LNG east to Asia or west to Europe, depending on market conditions, much like Qatar has been able to do for years. Putin sees this as cementing Russia's role as a top-tier global energy power.
Okay, this complex web of energy and politics. Let's shift focus to the Middle East, another region where this plays out intensely, especially after the Arab Spring.
Yeah, and to really get the current situation, you almost have to go back over a century to the Sykes-Picot Agreement during World War I.
The secret deal between Britain and France to carve up the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. True lines on a map that often ignored the existing ethnic, tribal, and religious realities on the ground. Those borders have been a source of tension ever since.
And there were attempts to change them.
Oh, yes. Early Arab nationalists like Nasser in Egypt dreamed of erasing those colonial lines and creating a unified Arab state. But those ambitions never really came to fruition. Then, a major turning point was the Iranian Revolution in 1979.
Right, that brought a radically different regime to power in Tehran.
And it pulled the U.S. much deeper into the region's conflicts. The new Iranian regime was hostile to the U.S., the Great Satan, and also targeted traditional U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, especially after Egypt made peace with Israel.
Then came the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 80s.
A horrific conflict, 8 years long, incredibly costly for both sides. And interestingly, Saudi Arabia actually backed Saddam Hussein's Iraq despite their own issues with him because they saw revolutionary Iran as the bigger threat.
That rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran has really shaped the region ever since.
It's a central fault line. Tehran has consistently supported groups aiming to destabilize Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies.
Then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990.
Another massive shock. It highlighted just how critical Kuwaiti and Saudi oil reserves were to the global economy. There was a real fear Saddam could control a huge chunk of the world's oil supply, become the arbiter of world oil, as some put it.
Which led to the first Gulf War.
Yes, and the liberation of Kuwait. But the aftermath in Iraq, things like de-Baathification, arguably contributed to instability down the line.
Fast forward a bit, and we get the confrontation over Iran's nuclear program.
Right, leading to stringent international sanctions led by the U.S. And here's where the U.S. shale revolution played a crucial, perhaps unexpected role globally. Because the massive increase in U.S. shale oil production, along with Saudi Arabia and others boosting their output, meant that even with Iranian oil largely off the market due to sanctions, there wasn't a major global shortage or a crazy price spike.
Ah, so shale acted as a kind of global shock absorber.
In effect, yes. It demonstrated how shale had altered the dynamics of global oil markets and arguably increased the effectiveness of sanctions against Iran. Then, of course, came the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, aimed at limiting Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief.
Though the long-term success of that deal has been heavily debated.
Very much so. Meanwhile, Iran was developing its regional strategy, this axis of resistance, a network of allied states and militant groups across the region, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen. Figures like Qasem Soleimani were key architects of this network.
And then came 2011, the Arab Spring.
A wave of protests that swept across the region with wildly different outcomes. In Egypt, Mubarak fell. Libya collapsed into chaos after Gaddafi's overthrow. Bahrain saw protests largely suppressed with help from neighboring Gulf states.
In Syria.
Syria descended into a brutal, devastating civil war that's still ongoing, drawing in regional powers like Iran and Turkey, and global powers like Russia, which intervened decisively to save the Assad regime, despite early calls from leaders like President Obama for Assad to step aside.
The war in Yemen also fits this pattern, right? A proxy conflict.
Very much so. It's largely seen as a proxy war between a Saudi-led coalition supporting the internationally recognized government and Iran backing the Houthi rebels. For Riyadh, the idea of an Iranian-backed force consolidating power on its southern border is a major strategic nightmare.
And amidst all this turmoil, there were new energy developments, too.
Yes, the discovery of significant natural gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean, off the coasts of Israel and Cyprus fields like Tamar and Leviathan for Israel. This could potentially end Israel's long-standing energy import dependency.
But also creating new potential friction points.
Exactly. Maritime boundary disputes, competition over export routes. It adds another layer of complexity. And we can't forget the rise of ISIS during this period, exploiting the chaos in Iraq and Syria, which became a major global security crisis.
So a very volatile picture in the Middle East, deeply intertwined with energy resources and rivalries.
Absolutely. Now, stepping back to the global picture, there's this massive trend, the energy transition.
Right, the shift away from fossil fuels towards renewables. Solar and wind are becoming much more mainstream, much cheaper.
They are, but they come with challenges. The big one is intermittency. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So you need major upgrades to electricity grids to handle that variability and, crucially, large-scale energy storage. Batteries are improving, but we're not quite there yet for grid-scale needs.
And internationally, we have the Paris Agreement.
Yes, a global pact where countries submit their own voluntary targets, nationally determined contributions, or NDCs to try and limit global warming. The fact that it was non-binding was key to getting initial agreement, especially for the U.S. at the time.
We're also seeing pressure from the financial world, right?
Definitely. Big investors like BlackRock are pushing companies harder to disclose and manage climate-related risks. You see the rise of green bonds to fund sustainable projects. There's a real movement of capital, or at least pressure to move capital.
And divestment campaigns.
Yes, pushing institutions to sell off fossil fuel holdings, though the counter-argument is whether that actually reduces emissions if the demand for those fuels remains high, or if it just shifts ownership.
It seems like the commitment varies a lot globally.
It does. Europe is aiming to be the first carbon-neutral continent. You have ambitious proposals like the Green New Deal debated in the U.S., but progress is uneven.
China plays a huge role here too, doesn't it?
Immense. They absolutely dominate the solar panel manufacturing industry, and they're also the largest market for solar installations. And wind power.
Wind is growing fast too, becoming more efficient. Interestingly, in the U.S., Texas, often thought of as oil and gas country, is actually the leading state for wind power generation by a long shot.
But experts say current technology isn't enough to get to net zero emissions.
That's the consensus. People like Ernest Moniz, former U.S. Energy Secretary, stress that we need major breakthroughs in things like advanced batteries, maybe hydrogen fuel, carbon capture technology to really decarbonize completely.
And even with the transition, oil isn't disappearing overnight.
No. Projections suggest that even by 2050, there could still be 1 billion or more gasoline-powered cars on the road globally, although hopefully much more fuel-efficient ones.
We should probably also quickly touch on plastics.
Yeah, it's linked. Plastic production relies heavily on fossil fuels. And the plastic waste issue, particularly ocean pollution, is a huge environmental challenge. Though it's important to note that most of that ocean plastic actually comes from a relatively small number of major rivers, primarily in Asia and Africa. Okay, one last pair of critical regions: the South China Sea and the Arctic.
Right, both becoming hotspots of strategic competition, with energy playing a role, though maybe differently in each. The South China Sea is just this critical junction of global power politics.
You've got competing claims over islands and maritime territory, freedom of navigation issues, massive trade flows.
Exactly. The U.S. emphasizes freedom of the seas, its alliances with Southeast Asian nations. China asserts broad historical claims, often referencing the 9-dash line, a vague line on Chinese maps originating back in the 1930s, basically viewing most of the sea as its historical waters.
And billions, maybe trillions, in trade passes through there every year.
A huge percentage of global maritime trade. So control of those sea lanes is strategically vital. This is where you see that direct U.S.-China geopolitical rivalry playing out. The U.S. sees China trying to rewrite the rules of the international order.
And China sees the U.S. trying to contain its rise.
That's their perspective, yes. Feeling encircled by U.S. alliances and military presence. And notably, Russia has sided with China on this. Putin has explicitly said non-regional powers, meaning the U.S., should stay out of the disputes. Russian and Chinese navies have even held joint exercises there.
Is there a lot of oil and gas under the South China Sea? Is that driving the conflict?
Actually, the proven reserves in the most contested areas are thought to be relatively limited. There might be potential, but it's not like the Persian Gulf. So while resources are a factor, many analysts believe the primary driver is strategic position, control over trade routes, and national prestige, rather than an immediate grab for energy wealth.
And the rise of container shipping just made those sea lanes even more important.
Absolutely. Malcolm McLean's innovation revolutionized global trade, and the South China Sea is like the main highway for those containers.
Okay, finally, the Arctic. Melting ice is opening it up.
Increasingly so. And for Russia, this is particularly significant because of the Northern Sea route along its northern coast.
The shortcut to Asia.
Potentially, yes. Especially for shipping LNG from projects like Yamal in the Arctic to markets in China, Japan, and South Korea. It's a considerably shorter voyage than going south through the Suez Canal.
But it's not smooth sailing yet.
No. Ice conditions are still a major challenge. Weather is harsh. It requires specialized ice-breaking ships. So for now, it's more supplementary than a replacement for traditional routes. But Russia sees developing the NSR and its Arctic LNG capacity as reinforcing its status as a global energy superpower, giving it another outlet to Asia.
Wow, okay, so pulling this all together after that tour of the globe.
It really underscores just how tightly woven energy, geopolitics, and national strategy have become. You can't really understand one without considering the others.
Yeah, the U.S. shale boom wasn't just a domestic event. It had global consequences for oil prices, for the effectiveness of sanctions, for alliances.
And China's Belt and Road isn't just about infrastructure. It's actively reshaping energy flows and potentially geopolitical alignments for decades to come.
Russia clearly sees energy as a core part of its toolkit on the world stage.
While the Middle East, post-Arab Spring, remains incredibly complex, volatile, and absolutely central to global energy security, even with the transition underway.
And that transition itself, moving towards renewables, managing climate change that presents huge challenges, but also massive opportunities for every country.
Exactly. It's forcing new calculations, new investments, new potential conflicts even, over resources like critical minerals needed for batteries and turbines.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on. As this energy transition gathers speed and as strategic competition heats up in places like the South China Sea and the Arctic, how is that going to redraw the global power map over the next, say, 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, what new alliances might form? What old rivalries might deepen or change as countries grapple with securing their energy needs while also trying to meet climate goals? It's a fascinating and, frankly, critical question.
It really is a map that's still being drawn. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the powerful forces shaping it.